Um, as you see, we have 4 participants. We are all already here on the stage. And generally thinking this should be understood as a certain continuation of what we have been talking these 2 days, but also a certain broadening of this general perspective of art, of condition of labor, division of labor after work, etc., etc. And when I say broadening, of course I mean certain space. But this is the question, and we will try to answer this question, whether this space is a historical space, whether it is a time space or not, whether the condition within which this has been happening can be called a historical condition. We will first start. We will first start with a certain local situation. Malgorzata, you will talk about experiences of the so-called transition, meaning Polish transition to the, this is transition to democracy, the post-communist transition. This is already an interesting concept because the transition implies a certain time space. Just to remind you that the so-called democratic revolutions already in 1990 were defined by Jürgen Habermas as die nachholende Revolution, the catching up revolutions. The idea is that what happened 1990, 89, 90, and what changed the Eastern Europe, in fact cleared, as he says explicitly, cleared the way for the societies of Eastern Europe to catch up with the mixed modernist development. Mixed modernist development meaning the development, normal historical development in the West. So we will come to this immediately defined the space of the East, of the former East, as a time space, which means as a space of belated modernity. The problem is, of course, and this is one of our questions, whether this condition is a historical condition for the notion of the East functions, which has obviously survived the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, implies historical amnesia. For the East has a history, but a history that has been, should be better forgotten, because it is of no value whatsoever. At the same time, the West is a space of a non-historical space, a space that not only does no longer have history, its own history, it doesn't have any history. This is why it could have been made canonic and in general. So these are the spaces we will be talking about, and saying spaces, I mean also this, the space of globalization. The space of globalization is not a unified common space. Rather, it is a certain regime of divisions and boundaries. Precisely as such, it makes possible what we call global capitalism. And we will be, Sandro will talk about. It's becoming hot, as you see, hot topic. So I suggest, as I say, the question is whether this space is a condition historical or not. Just to remind you, and I would like to give you as a certain picture as a metaphor of what we are going to talk about. This sentence of Francis Fukuyama from the closing paragraph at the end of history, 26 years ago, published, when he says, in a post-historical period, there will be neither art nor philosophy, just a perpetual caretaking of the museum of human history. So within this metaphor, I think the question whether this temporality deserves to be called historical or not is an open question. Malgorzata, you come from Poland, and you did your research on festival economy in the period of transition. You are sociologist, feminist, unionist, trade unionist, and you published already the research, and it's your PhD thesis, Transition and its Consequences for the Social Reproduction, Working and Living Conditions of Women in Wałbrzych region. And you will talk about the results of this research. So please.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for the invitation. More or less, I would like to speak about two examples of global exploitation chains in Poland. And then I will try to skip to the transition as one of the triggers of those global exploitation chains. What are the global exploitation chains? How we could define them? We could look at them as the kind of links which point to the exploitation which takes place in one localization and is interrelated with the exploitation that takes place in other localization. For instance, I worked on the production line, and part of the assembly products, the parts to mount the LCD TVs, were transferred from Indonesia to Poland, and we mounted the product, the final product, for LG Corporation. So that's how I perceive, that's how I understand global exploitation chains. The same happens in Indonesia as in Poland. So two examples of global exploitation chains which run through Poland are, from my perspective, one could be named as global commodity flow, and thus global exploitation chain related to that. And the second one is related to care economy and care work. Namely, Poland could be is a kind of a place of crossroad of global care chain, which also creates a specific forms of exploitation. So the first one, global commodity flow, we could point that Poland is, as a territory of foreign direct investments, Poland plays a kind of a stopover role in a global commodity chain, as we can describe it in other terms, a kind of assembly line for Western Europe. Taking under consideration two industries where I done my research, namely auto industry and electronic industry, we can point that in the production relies mainly on parts imported from the east, from other regions. Particularly in the electronics, the products are imported from South and Central Asia. So, thus, Poland is a kind of a final or semi-final place where final or semi-final products are mounted and exported further to the West. The companies of or the global corporations located in Poland usually do not pay taxes, as they are located in kind of territories which are called special economic zones. which are exempt for this kind of obligations. The work on the production line, as in the other places, is poorly paid, is arduous, repetitive, and alienating, but also it's involving semi-skilled or unskilled labor. For instance, in auto industry in Poland, where the salaries are a little bit higher than in the electronic industry, the production worker earns circa 12 to 15 zloty, which is more or less 4 or 4.5 euro. And his or her colleagues working for the same corporation, but in Germany, earn 4 or 5 times more. So, and today we are facing a very blunt example of how global exploitation chain works in Poland, as we have for 1 year right now the Amazon in Poland, which moved a part of its warehouses to Poland exactly because the massive strikes in Germany, which took place 2 years ago. And one more thing about this kind of global exploitation chain is that we can see that in Germany the workers earn circa 10 euro per hour, and in Poland they earn less than 3 euro. The other global exploitation chain which runs through Poland relies on a global care chain. So on the one hand we have well-off upper households which can afford to hire cleaners, nurses, or nannies from Belarus or from Ukraine, paying them usually below the minimum wage, which is circa 350 euro in Poland. And on the other hand, we have a rapidly growing labor market of Polish women migrating, but in an organized way, to Germany, Netherlands, or Norway to work as the elderly carers. They earn more or less 900 euro per month and work 24 hours, 7 days a week for 2 or 3 months, and then they get back to Poland. And that the cycle repeats. After staying in Poland for 1 month, they migrate for the next job. So we can see a repetitive move how the level of wages and the welfare push and pulls women from middle and low income households to migrate to find better jobs in their countries where the wages are quite a little bit higher. One reason for this is, of course, the global capital flow, the way how the capital outsources or offshores the jobs and move them to the locations where the labor is cheaper or more accessible. However, from my perspective, also crucial is state policies, which creates and enables this kind of global exploitation chain locally. For the last 15 years, we can observe in Poland policies which strengthen and lead to flexibilization of labor market, and namely the regulation of employment relations, and keeping on, but also the policies are focused on keeping the real wages frozen. On the other hand, we are observing austerity measures, namely cuts in social spendings or limiting the access and the groups entitled to social provisions. The policies are also focused on commercialization and privatization of public sphere. This is nothing unusual for other European countries. However, in Poland, we experienced this and lived through this for the last 26 years right now, namely from the moment of shock therapy, which took place in the early 90s. In the other words, we can call it a shock doctrine, as Naomi Klein calls it. So in Poland, this kind of neoliberal policies, which are now very explicit in Spain, in Italy, in Portugal, in Greece, have been taking place in Poland since the last 25 years. Now, as I am a sociologist, so I like numbers, and I would like to point to a few numbers to show you the mechanisms, and also to show you this kind of, when the repression takes place, there is also a kind of reaction, workers' reaction, in organizing, in protesting, in striking. So here you can see the unemployment and atypical employment in Poland, and I would like to point to the blue line, which is a line pointing to share of employees with a contract of limited duration. And this is what we call, also in our union, a kind of a junk contracts, which do not provide workers with social securities. And you can see in the graph that they just exploded in the early 2000s. And this is exactly because of foreign direct investments entering Poland and establishing new factories, new plants with new employment relations, very flexible, very deregulated, and hiring people through temporary work agencies or with the contracts that do not give any kind of security. At the same time, you can observe the red line, which points to unemployment rate in Poland. And you can see when they started to build this kind of new investments located mainly in special economic zones, the unemployment rate dropped. And the Polish government pointed that, look, here we create new jobs. But on the other hand, we observed that those jobs were very insecure, very precarious. Okay, let's go through the next slide. How should I do it? Just like this. Okay, and this graph points to the scope of foreign migration of Poles in since 2004. Since the possibilities to migrate to European Union, this was mainly labor migration. A lot of Poles migrated. More or less, we can say that today 3 million people, mostly young people, lives and works abroad. And as we could observe the drop in unemployment since the mid-2000s, it was one of the outcomes of mass labor migration from Poland, mainly to UK and Germany, to look for better living and working conditions. This is a situation. This situation created also a kind of a safety wealth for the government. In other words, if not the migration, we could observe in Poland a mass riots or mass strikes or mass demonstration, exactly because the very unstable conditions on the labor market. And as some, now I would like to go to the next graph and point that as some analysis points that when we have unemployment drop and there is a kind of stabilization on the labor market, which happens exactly because of mass migration in Poland, the bargaining position of workers is more powerful, and thus we can call it that the structural power of workers is better. And in this sense, it created a possibility of massive strikes in Poland since 2006 until 2008, with a peak in 2008 of 13,000 strikes. Now, as you can observe in the graph, we have barely no strikes in Poland. There is the graph ends in 2012. However, when I checked the data for 2013, it was only 30 strikes with 18,000 strikers. So one reason for this is that maybe we could predict that in few years there will be an outburst, there will be an explosion of strikes in Poland, exactly because the unemployment is quite low. There is the ratio of migration is also quite low right now and stabilized. However, exactly because we observed the explosion of this kind of junky jobs and junky contracts, very precarious employment conditions. We could say that many workers right now, many of us here from Poland in this room, are deprived of the right to strike, are deprived not even to the right to strike, but also the right to unionize. And exactly because of this situation, there is a shift of the forms of how we struggle, how we fight back. As Boris mentioned, I am not only a researcher, but I'm also a unionist. And as a unionist, I also observed how we struggle in our union. And one of the examples of our struggle is a demonstration which took place last year this year in May. This was a part of campaign My Prekariat, Us the Precariat, which yesterday Igor was telling you about. This points also to this was organized mainly by our committee of art workers. Very successful campaign. A very good demonstration, but also it points that our forms of struggles are shifting and changing. We are not able to strike, however, we can observe the ongoing number of demonstrations in Poland and protests. The other form of protesting which has been changing is or tactic of protesting is occupation. So rather than having or organizing strikes, we have more demonstration, more protest, or more occupations because of precarious condition on the labor market. And I think I will end up here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Malgorzata. If you have any question that relates directly to what has been said, please, or immediate comment. If not, we proceed, because I think this is a good introduction into what Sandro will talk about, and we saw how these divisions make it possible to function, this type of production, and how the space is actually well connected from Central Asia to the Western Europe. Sandro is a political philosopher. He comes from Bologna, where he teaches political theory. He wrote many books, but I will mention only the last one, which is crucial for this talk, which he wrote with Brett Nielsen, and this is Border as Method, or the subtitle is The Multiplication of Labor. Please, Sandro.
Yes, thank you very much, Boris. Thank you for inviting me to participate in these 2 days of discussion that have been really challenging to me. The topic of this panel is a global perspective on labor. We are not talking about the globe. We are talking about a global perspective on labor. We are taking processes of globalization as a crucial epistemic angle, also on very local developments. And the presentation by Malgorzata has been a good instantiation of this kind of shift in the way in which we look at processes of labor exploitation, also in their very localized form from a global kind of angle. Talking of the global doesn't mean talking of an increasingly homogeneous space. I think this is a very important point that has been made by many thinkers, researchers on globalization over the last decade. Brett Nielsen and I proposed in the book that has been just mentioned by Boris to take precisely the multiplication of borders and divisions as a kind of privileged angle on processes of globalization, on the emergence of a global space, on global capitalism. And I would like to start by saying something about global capitalism, about the predicament of global capitalism. I would like to pick up a point from Brian Holmes' lecture yesterday. I was totally fascinated by many aspects of his talk. In the morning, I was looking for flights to Detroit. I've never been there, and you convinced me. We'll meet in Detroit. But there is, in a way, a point that did not convince me fully, and it has to do with the kind of cyclical understanding of crisis that Brian was, in a way, presenting yesterday, starting from Kondratyev's theory of waves and so on. So this idea that the current crisis will be followed by a new moment of expansion of capitalism. I'm a bit simplifying Brian's argument in order to discuss it. But what if we take as a point of departure a different hypothesis? What if we depart from the hypothesis that what we have been experiencing over the last decades has been precisely a kind of shattering of the temporal and spatial coordinates of capitalist development that produces a situation in which crisis and expansion are not opposite terms. They are, in a way, kind of contemporary in the global capitalist formation. I think that such an hypothesis would lead us to shift a bit the discussion on global capitalism, would lead us to take seriously the idea that the temporality of transition is going to characterize global capitalist formations over the next decades. So I would like to expand a bit on this hypothesis and on the idea that temporal and spatial coordinates of capitalist development have been shattered and reshuffled over the last years. The very idea of recovery seems to be shattered when the rationality of capitalism is dominated by financial instability and by the attempt to make it productive. Just think of the so-called flash crash of May 6, 2010, when the Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged by around 1,000 points within minutes, and then recovered equally quickly. This is a quite interesting fact in itself. There's a lot to say about high frequency trading, about algorithm-led finance. But it can also be taken as a kind of metaphor of what I was saying before about kind of intertwining between crisis and recovery, between slump and expansion. And then among the tendencies underlying the current crisis of capitalism are the shattering of old spatial hierarchies, the reshuffling of geographies of development, and the emergence of new regionalisms and patterns of multilateralism. All these tendencies are not smooth. They are all conflict-ridden. And the presence of war, the continuous presence of war on the global scale says a lot about the tensions and the conflicts that crisscross these spatial displacements of capitalist development. I think it is important to mention what happened today in Ankara in order to be aware of the fact that war, violence are among us and not in some distant place. In Ankara, there was a blast during a peace demonstration with more than 90 people dying. And I mean, I will not expand on that because otherwise, but I thought it was known. So let me come now more closely to the topic of the former West project. And I do it by saying that within this tumultuous scenario of transformations, turmoil, tensions, the possibility of a capitalist world system without a Western center is very concrete for the 21st century. And it would be, of course, quite a rupture within a 5 centuries long history. There is a need to take stock of the meaning of such a rupture, both in terms of its potentialities and, as I was saying, in terms of its risks. Needless to say, I'm not blind neither to the persistent huge concentration of wealth and power in the West, nor to the epistemic continuities of Eurocentrism in the contemporary world. But I think we should discuss these topics that are crucial to the former West project against the background of the hypothesis I mentioned before, which means of the hypothesis of an emerging global capitalist system without a Western center. And so it is from this point of view that I would like to directly tackle one of the main questions posed by Boris in an email that he sent to me last week. How does the global organization of labor relate to the presence of this huge normative identity block and power structure that we call West? So my main answer refers to a specific component of what Dipesh Chakrabarty calls the imaginary figure of Europe, which means the idea that free wage labor is to be considered the norm and standard labor relation within history and present of modern capitalism. And this is a crucial point, both regarding the way in which narratives and politics of development continue to be fostered in many parts of the world according to the model of catch-up modernization, and regarding the way in which we imagine the working class living labor as the subject of political and social transformation. Is it possible to talk of global labor today? What is global labor? I think it is impossible to tackle this question without going back to the extraordinary invention and history of proletarian internationalism. Shortly put, for want of time, it was basically the concept of abstract labor in its connection with another important concept, the one of world market, that allowed Marx to imagine the unity of labor at the international scale in a time in which the very process of nationalization of the territorial state in Europe was far from completed. In a concrete sense, we can suggest that it was more difficult for Marx than it is for us today to imagine the workers of the world, as Michael Denning puts it, constituting an interconnected global labor force sharing a common situation. But the main problem here regards precisely the misinterpretation, what I think to be the misinterpretation of abstract labor, even in Marx, as necessarily leading to a steady homogenization of labor and life conditions of the exploited subjects under the domain of capitalism. Our global condition, our global predicament demonstrates that this is not the case. To the intensification of homogenizing trends of capitalist operations, a deep heterogeneity in the composition of labor corresponds, not simply dividing discrete nations, regions, cities, but cutting across each single location. And this is the main problem, I think, we have to confront nowadays. From a political point of view, but also from the point of view of sociological investigation. In order to tackle this question, to make sense of the gap and tensions between what we call with Deleuze and Guattari the increasingly homogeneous axiomatic of global capital and the increasingly heterogeneous composition of living labor, Brett Nilsson and I have introduced in our book, Borderless Method, the notion of a global multiplication of labor, and I will conclude by saying something about this notion. So what do we mean by the notion of multiplication of labor? We have tried to distinguish three dimensions of multiplication. Intensification of labor, which means labor's tendency to colonize the entire life of laboring subjects, became even more pronounced than before. Then diversification of labor, subjective labor positions, activities, and tasks are multiplied, challenging the very possibility to identify a specifically homogeneous figure, be it the industrial or the cognitive worker, as hegemonic within the entirety of dependent labor. And then, third dimension, heterogenization of labor. Legal and social regimes of its organization are also multiplied beyond the very possibility of identifying a standard or a norm. I am convinced that these three processes are present, although taking very different shapes and entering into very different formations and combinations in most part of the world today, more often than not connected with practices, movements of migration and labor mobility. And we should analyze them not simply looking at the kind of post-colonial predicament they embody, but also at the potential elements of excess, at the challenges they pose to control and exploitation. Let me also say that such a concept as the multiplication of labor poses crucial challenges also from an epistemic point of view, meaning that it is no longer true, if it ever was, that we have to position ourselves in the presumed center of the capitalist world system to grasp its main tendencies. And it also poses interesting challenges from the point of view of the, let's say, aesthetic representation of global labor. Just think of the amazing photographic book by John Berger and Jean Moore, A Seventh Man, published in 1975, which portrayed the condition of migrants in Europe taking mail factory workers in the heyday of Fordism as iconic and standard figures. Would it be possible today? It is, of course, not only a problem of adding figures. It is much more about grasping and, in a way, representing the shifting boundaries and connections between the figures produced by processes of multiplication of labor. So summing up and concluding very quickly, more and more global capitalism is defined by the elements of heterogeneity I have been mentioning thus far, by the contemporary and structurally related existence of, let's say, new economy and sweatshops, corporatization of capital and accumulation in primitive forms, processes of financialization and forced labor. And while capital has effective means to synchronize the corresponding forms of labor and translating them into the language of its own valorization, particularly through the current hegemony of finance, a labor politics of translation, as I would like to call it, has still to be invented. And crucial to such a politics would be a politicization of the exploited social cooperation, an attempt to read processes of multiplication of labor beyond the idea that they only correspond to a fragmentation of labor, taking seriously the hypothesis that this heterogeneous and diverse social cooperation is the main productive force nowadays. So crucial to such a politics of translation would be a politicization of the exploited social cooperation, capable to appropriate the common resources that make this cooperation productive, while liberating them from capital's domination. It's again the dream of a thing, as Marx famously wrote to Ruge in 1843. It is again this kind of dream that we have to start to dream again. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandro. I think we have a good dynamics, and I would just, I suggest that we just proceed, because in a way you answered the question, what is former West? Former West is the global, the dynamic, the logic of the global capitalism that makes necessarily the West former, decentralizing, decentering this former position. And it was beautiful that you mentioned this. It was 2010, this flash crash. Just imagine, within 3 minutes, we had the crisis in which like trillions of dollars evaporated, and recovery within 3 minutes. What is this idea of crisis? What is the temporality of crisis? What is the temporality of of global capitalism. Sami comes now actually from Beirut, but originally he studied in Berlin at Free University in Berlin. He's actually expert for Walter Benjamin, and at the moment you teach, it's called Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow at the American University of Beirut. My question would be simple. What is the temporality of this global capitalism? How to think of this temporality? How to think of this events like crisis and recovery, and where is the West in this temporality? Please.
Thanks, Boris. Thanks for coming. Yeah, thank you for giving me 20 minutes for this, for the answer, for your question. Of course, this would be a book, and I think the answer is, of course, always in Capital Volume 1. Thanks to the organizers, of course, for their hospitality. I will not waste my 20 minutes with further announcements. I just start. Okay. In the Grundrisse, Marx wrote, "The so-called historical presentation of development is founded as a rule on the fact that the latest form regards the previous ones as steps leading up to itself." Actually, is that okay with the sound? Okay. The illusion of the model of so-called catch-up modernization follows the same logic. At a certain moment, capitalism imagines itself as the norm vis-à-vis earlier formations of capitalism. In modern times, this view could rely on different conceptual frameworks to endow its illusions with meaning or scientific authority. While the worldviews of theological eschatology, historical teleology, social and scientific progress, uneven or linear development could still rely on the idea that there is such a thing as history, after 1989, this view came into crisis. Fukuyama's para-Hegelian thesis of an end of history became an integral part of the capitalist realist fantasy. Accomplishing the historical working through of world spirit's earlier stages, capitalist world history reveals itself as the world market. History in and for itself has arrived in a global post-historical equilibrium disturbed only by seemingly external frictions, tensions and conflicts which appear as ultimately solvable, that is the Clinton era, or at least manageable, that would be Bush the Younger. In post-historical world capitalism, thus, the idea of teleological progress lost its historical staging ground. As a result, the concept of progress was detemporalized, that is, spatialized. To be sure, the seemingly eternal presence of the world market knows different local temporalities. But these temporalities are always already mapped by and inscribed into the standard of capitalism's ahistorical here and now. Of course, this form of time is exactly the temporal form of abstract labor, but I won't go into detail here. It comes as no surprise that in a world of different local temporalities without history, space becomes the main marker of progress, development, and evolution. The rise of area studies as an academic discipline that substitutes the historical science of sociology can be read as a symptom. The capitalist post-histoire knows no history, only the prehistory of its own contemporaneous space. In other words, also the concept of catch-up modernization is not anymore bound to temporal teleology, but functions as a measurement of the accessibility of localizable places to capital investment, production and reproduction. Capital simply asks, how does a certain place perform within the global space of the capitalist world market? The historical antagonism of dominant world history against what Benjamin called the tradition of the oppressed is now restaged as the violent integration of places into space. Current forms of anti-capitalist resistance can be read as rebellions of certain places against capital space. This integration or reintegration of places into the space of the world market is a spatialized term for what Marx called original accumulation, ursprüngliche Akkumulation, the eternal recurrence of capitalism's Urszene, primal scene. I know the correct translation would be primitive accumulation, but I take the Marxian translation for a certain reason. This Ursprung, or literally primal leap, origin, has to be repeated always anew in order to keep capitalism alive. You can say more alive than life. That would be then a theory of the undead temporality of capitalism as a dead eternity. That would be another paper. Hence, original accumulation, the violent separation of labor power from the means of production, does not designate a primitive stage of capitalism that took place once upon a time, but the non-historicizable origin and starting point of each stage of capitalist accumulation. In other words, is our present in this space of global world market. Today, however, the capitalist realist fantasy of a self-regulating world market bound to perfection, self-improvement and ecological sustainability has lost its historical horizon. In a way, one could argue that theory has already reacted to this transformation. The return of cosmologies under the watchword of object-oriented ontology or new materialism might be a symptom of the self-voiding of the historical imaginary in the age of post-historical capitalism. At the same time, the accelerationist conjuration of large-scale projects of modernism might be read as a countermove to regain a historical imaginary once more. However, we cite in these current debates the decline of history and the spatialization of time have also narrowed the radical leftist horizon. It seems that in the age of capitalist realism, we have to choose between either fetishizing the past, that is what commemoration culture industry does, producing memory without history, or abandon the historical battlefield altogether and engage in more cosmological questions about the impact of humankind on the planet and the universe. And of course, some people would call it the discourse on the so-called Anthropocene. I mean, there are also critical takes on that, but there's a certain tendency to bracket the capitalist relation in this discourse, and then you have, of course, a more cosmological battlefield. In this paper, however, I would like to suggest a third option, revisiting the question battlefield of history through the theoretical lenses of Benjamin and to this extent of Marx. Benjamin's messianic version of historical materialism addressed Marx's most decisive points of critique. First, the historization of capitalism as a socially and historically specific, yet ultimately contingent, that is, non-necessary mode of production. And second, the conceptualization of history as a process of dynamic social forces and their struggles. As we shall see, Benjamin's criticism of vulgar Marxist and historicist historiography laid bare the fundamental paradox of any concept of history based upon linearity, succession, and homogeneity. You can also say of causality in a very vulgar, flat sense applied to history. Benjamin's Marxian question was how to conceive of the relationship of the political presence of class struggle and historical experience without relying on a meta or trans-historical perspective. If past and present are not bound together in a linear way, but form an anachronic constellation of what he calls Jetztzeit or now time, how are we to refrain from taking the teleological perspective of the coming to itself of capital history as world market space? Or to put it differently, how are we to historicize capitalism's mode of dehistorization by constructing a materialist concept of time? That would be the larger question, but I don't have time for that. As is well known, for Benjamin, history is not a progressive flow of homogeneous and empty time, but a non-linear constellation of past and present shot through with sparks of messianic time. Benjamin calls these short circuits of past and present now time. According to this anti-evolutionary concept of history, the past is never simply gone. It can never be fully historicized unless it is recalled, cited in a revolutionary way. Only if politics has the capacity to anticipate the kairos, the opportune moment for what Benjamin calls a tiger's leap into the past, the dialectical leap which Marx understood as revolution, can interrupt the catastrophic course of history. In this way, history, historiography, and revolutionary action are inextricably intertwined. A seemingly neutral perspective, detached from political struggles, only leads to what he calls empathy with the victor. And the rulers at any time, as Benjamin reminds us, are the heirs of those who have been victorious throughout history. Against this form of victor's history, be it historicist, progressivist, or evolutionist, Benjamin calls for a truly historical concept of history, aiming at the revolutionary encounter of past and present, accessible only for what he calls the struggling oppressed class. And if I say historical concept of history, it all comes down to the point to give this a non-tautological meaning. What is a historical concept of history, or what is historical time? This teleological stance against linear time is not limited to an epistemological argument or an alternative historiography, but aims at a radically new concept of history affecting the ontological status of the past happening. Benjamin's critique of capitalist progress exceeds the scope of a mere critique of historicist or social democratic ideologies. Rather, it points to the real process of capitalist history as the self-temporalizing movement of capital time bound to future cycles of capitalist accumulation. This is what I called the end of time, or that could be called spatialization, and of course Fukuyama gave a theory of that. So that is to say, homogeneous and empty time is not only a question of false historiography or false consciousness, but a question of a never closed or accomplished ontology of capital time. As Marx already argued, the obstacle to such a completion is internal to capital time itself. It is class struggle and the proletariat. However you want to define the proletariat today, as a subject or as a position or as a structural condition inscribed into class struggle, but that is up to discussion. Slavoj Žižek rightly points out that in his earlier readings on Benjamin, he said that Benjamin's anti-historicist stance relies on a, quote, revolutionary act that will retroactively realize the crushed longings of all past failed revolutionary attempts, end of quote. Only a revolutionary act within class struggle can actualize and fully realize a past that has not yet existed. From a historical perspective, the past is still ahead of us. Quote from Žižek, what this means is that in a properly historical perspective, as opposed to evolutionarist historicism, the past is not simply past, but bears within its proper utopian promise of a future redemption. In order to understand the past epoch properly, it is not sufficient to take into account the historical conditions out of which it grew. One has also to take into account the utopian hopes of a future that were betrayed and crushed by it, that which was negated, that which did not happen, so that the past historical reality was the way it was, end of quote. Understood in this way, messianic, and I say here messianic, not utopian, probably you can discuss on the terminology here, but understood in this way, messianic redemption is not about some apocalyptic intrusion from outside, the divine intervention into human affairs, but about the restoring, or in more theological terms, the restitutio in integrum or tikkun of the past's repressed potentialities. This restoration is not conservative but opening. It exposes the present as changeable. The task is not to rewrite history from the perspective of the present, but to destabilize the seemingly solid ground of the present. The quote Žižek again, To put it in clearer terms, when we say the present redeems the past itself, that the past itself contained a sign which pointed towards the present, we are not making a historicist relativist statement about how there is no objective history, how we always interpret the past from our present horizon of understanding, how in defining past epochs we always, consciously or not, imply our present point of view. Rather, what we are claiming is something more radical. What the proper historical stance, as opposed to historicism, relativizes is not the past, always distorted by our present point of view, but paradoxically the present itself. Zizek's reading of Benjamin captures the radical kernel of Benjamin's thesis on the concept of history, as I would argue. Benjamin's inherently theological or messianic dimension does not contradict or compromise his Marxist impulse. Rather, the displaced language of theology functions here as a corrective of scientific Marxism to flesh out the revolutionary core of a genuinely historical materialist concept of history vis-à-vis historicist, evolutionist, or metaphysical or post-histoire philosophies of history, which either eternalize or dehistoricize the past. The past is never just out there. It is not a given a fait accompli, since it is never ontologically fully constituted. Without its hidden, repressed, or crushed potentialities, the past never arrives at the point where it can become history in its full sense. But how can the present and its current political struggles redeem the past and make it history? An act is never a transparent, consciously or voluntarily performed action that can be appropriated by a certain subject. Rather, quote Zizek, in an authentic act, the highest freedom coincides with the utmost passivity, with a reduction to a lifeless automaton who blindly performs its gestures. I won't go into the details of this Lacanian reading, but I think the line of argument is clear. The act of retroactively changing the past is such an act in which radical activity, class struggle, and utmost passivity, what Benjamin calls the weak messianic force, coincide. Paradoxically, the gestures of such passive active acts are performed by subjects who cannot fully own or monopolize their own acts. The gestures that redeem the past are not at the disposal of some self-identical subject of history, and to be sure, not to be monopolized by the state or the state-funded commemoration culture industry. Benjamin's key term to theorize the gestures of such active-passive acts is citation. The texture of a particular past is cited and thereby redeemed by a particular present. However, there is no author of history to sign this citation. To wrap up, I know I'm running out of time. In contrast to eschatological concept of history, Benjamin's peculiar take on the Jewish and Christian motive of the Messianic does not rely on the binary of either historical flatness, linear, fractured, future-directed, irreversible, or eschatological fullness, univocal, whole, eternal, circular. Rather, extensive history is only historical in the strict sense if punctuated by sparks of intensive messianicity. Historical time is time shot through with splinters of messianic time, as you wrote. Without this messianic tension, history is not historical but homogeneous and empty time. In this sense, history is ontologically incomplete. It lacks its messianic completion, fulfillment, and end. And it is only this structural lack that makes history historical. History as incomplete is bound to messianic redemption precisely for being unredeemed. In short, what makes history historical is not the reference to some primordial messianic unity or invoking an apocalyptic intrusion of the messianic world, but precisely the lack of such a reference. The sentence, history is ontologically incomplete, is not simply negative or privative. Rather, it also denotes the positive feature of having a lack. In other words, with postmodernism and the rise of what Fred Jameson called the cultural logic of late capitalism, the consciousness of such a lack had disappeared. Maybe the punks of the mid-late 70s were the last ones who had such a historical consciousness when they stated no future. Having no future, affirming the lack, is the ultimate gesture to be open to futurity at all. Today, we are lacking the lack. We do not even have no future. There is only the spuriously infinite extension of the present as unrelated singular now points. Okay, I stop here for sure. Thanks.
Thank you very much. This for especially for mentioning the punks of the 70s and the slogan "No Future," which is Johnny Rotten's "God Save the Queen." But just to remind you that actually 2011 in West End in London, they found on a wall in a flat drawings by Johnny Rotten. And this place, this house, was then declared a cultural heritage site. And you know, Johnny Rotten is one among these 100 great Britain. He was declared like 2010. So, future is a matter of cultural heritage, or Gerald Raunak? I forgot.
That's
I
fine.
Look at him and wait that he. Gerald Raunak comes from Zurich, teaches at Zürcher Hochschule for art, for Kunst, founding member of the European Institute of Progressive Cultural Policies, author of many books. You saw the books. I'm not going to repeat it, but if you like, you go to there are some of them. The last Dividuum. Gerald, please.
Boris, I think the story about Johnny Rotten's paintings is another fake from Malcolm McLaren. Wouldn't believe in it. This paper is called "No Future," by chance, and we didn't really. I mean, I knew that you were talking about now time, but we didn't have an agreement on starting and ending with "No Future." Of course, also when in Brian's keynote there was this critical comments on inventing the future, the book from Srnicek and Williams. I think a lot of it kind of resonates in this paper. And of course also when Isabel in her discussion had this clear position against utopia and future, it resonated. The talk will be about a certain concept of the line, will be about individuality and about the new figure of the artist. I hope it's going to be self-explanatory on this different concepts, but I want to have some preliminary remarks on the concept of machinic capitalism. I share this concept with Matteo Pasquinelli. Is he still here? Oh. Yeah. Hi, Matteo. But also maybe with many others. The concept is also one of the reasons that I use it is that I'm quite opposing the concept that repeatedly came up in the last days, the concept of neoliberalism, because there are a lot of reasons to oppose it, but the most obvious is that it might hide the extreme brutality and repression of capitalism in its actual form. And that's one reason why I'm using the term machinic capitalism. Of course, there is some Guattarian legacy behind it, and it helps us also to see the machinic not as a phase. So machinic capitalism is not a phase of capitalism, but it's interesting to have this perspective on the machinic in all times or phases of capitalism, and they are changing, of course. Concerning the question of former West, the machinic in machinic capitalism helps us to see, and I just repeat something that the colleagues were saying before, that capitalism is not a linear development, and of course this is also, to repeat it, against the idea of catch-up modernization, but also to reverse it, because there are certain interpretations of the time of transition that interpreted the transition and the Eastern European post-communist countries as kind of avant-garde. So this is a reversal of the idea of the catch-up modernization, but I think this is totally wrong too. It's this utmost complex relationship between former East and former West, between what Sandro called this shattered and reshuffled multiple divisions, what also came up in the example of Emerson. The interconnectedness of these kinds of machinic relationships. Of course, these relationships are utmost asymmetrical, but there is a constant moving from one topos to another. So this is maybe the preliminary remarks, and I start, what a surprise, also with Walter Benjamin, from the same last text of Benjamin that he wrote 75 years ago. He wrote, "Those who fell prey to the future seek advice from the soothsayers." One could adapt his writing today into, "Those who fell prey to the future seek advice from brokers, economists, analysts, and traders." The reality of today's individual data sets, enormous accumulations of data that can be divided, recomposed, and valorized in endless ways, is one of worldwide streams of deterritorialization and of machinic expansion, most succinctly expressed as big data. Facebook needs the self-division of individual users, just as intelligence agencies still hold on to individual identities. But big data, individual data, on the other hand, is less interested in individuals and just as little interested in a totalization of data, but all the more in data sets that are freely floating and as detailed as possible, which it can individually traverse as an open field of immanence with a potentially endless extension. These enormous multitudes of data seem to form a horizon of knowledge that governs and spatializes the entire past and present through capturing the future. The collection of data by economic and state actors, especially Secret Service, insurance and banking industries, has a long tradition, but it has gained a completely new quality with machine readability and the machinic processing of the data material. This quality applies not only to credit rating agencies or intelligence agencies, but also to all areas of networked everyday life, all partial data of individual lives. For instance, about children, divorces, debts, properties, consumption habits, communication behaviors, traveling habits, internet activities, movements in real space, whereabouts, health, fitness, eating habits, calorie consumption, dental care, credit card charges, cash machine use, to name only a few. Refrigerators, ovens, thermostats, smart guide, toothbrushes, intelligent toilet bowls, networked offices, networked kitchens, networked bedrooms, networked bathrooms, networked toilet facilities, all controllable via smartphone, all accessible via the cloud. This machinic data can potentially be combined, for instance, for the logistics of individual thing movements, and made accessible according to individual logics. In order to make it possible to traverse, divide, and recombine these data, cooperation is needed from those previously called consumers. Participation means the most comprehensible, free, especially in the sense of unpaid data exchange possible, not only sharing existing data, but also producing new data. Data valorization plays out in the terrain of externalizing production processes and activating consumers, as this has been intensified since the 1990s in all economic areas. Crowds, multitudes, dispersed masses, their modes of existence and living are captured, stretched, appropriated and exploited beyond the realm of paid labor. scoring, rating, ranking, profiling. Consumers who are activated and generate value with their activity do not have to be paid. The open source model of program development by the crowd has meanwhile become established as a business model and spread to all economic sectors. Free labor in free association, but to the advantage of the enterprises of ever new economies. And instead of the added value thus produced being invested in higher wages, the free labor of the freelance data brokers results in exactly the opposite consequences, namely a further devaluing and elimination of paid labor. The economy of partition and domination and repression becomes a no less dominating economy of dividing and sharing, boosted by self-government. A sharing economy that lifts the minus of community from the Christian genealogy into contemporary machinic capitalism. Appeals to cut spending, degrowth compulsion, austerity by other means. The compliant character is receptive, and this is of course also connected to the flexible personality is Brian's concept. The compliant character is receptive to machinic suggestions. Machinic control is expanding as far as it can. Everything is suggested wherever possible. There are no more open, unmeasured search movements. Yet not even the boundary between the measurable and the immeasurable is stable. The measuring gauges seek to reach further and further into the immeasurable. Not only the measurable is to be measured, but also as much of the immeasurable as possible is to be shifted into the area of the measurable. That's also, you have to consider the aspects of temporality when it comes to measurability and immeasurability. That is the endless desire of the modulating mode of collecting data, to maintain control not only over the measured and measurable territories, but also to penetrate into uncontrolled realms not previously desired and to measure them as exactly and comprehensively as possible. White spots in real and virtual spaces, videos that have not interested anyone before, internet links that have never been clicked on. The algorithm sparks capital's old fantasies of ending its dependency on living labor at last. If it is no longer managers, bankers, brokers, but rather programs that carry out calculations and computations and react to these kinds of calculations and computations, then it appears it is no longer humans operating with programs, but rather the programs with the humans. And I insist on that this is a fantasy and it stays a fantasy. It is not only that they subordinate themselves to the machines, the humans subordinate themselves to the machines, that they become part of the machine, like the workers in, for instance, Marx's machine fragment, but they are to be entirely, in the fantasy, are to be entirely swept away from the self-expanding fantasy of their screens. This is the image that Stefano Harney draws in the text Algorithmic Institutions and Logistical Capitalism, of the inventive and simultaneously suicidally murderous effect of the algorithm. In the fantasy of logistics, things talk directly with things. Reduction of all machinic relations to thing relationships, inversion of anthropocentrism. Instead of human beings, things are essentialized. Yet Stefano also describes how long before its expansion in finance, with the help of the algorithm in the operations management of bodies, machines, instruments, trucks, warehouses and factories, our own hands, our own labor, our own desire allowed a world to emerge that wanted to become a world without us. Operations management is the science and practice of the relationship between variable and constant capital in motion, in daily life perhaps even more influential and insidious than finance. The assembly line is the starting point for all the consideration of this once marginal area of management theory. And it is the assembly line, here the first aspect of the line, from which Stefano also develops his concept of the line. Workers and machines appear along the line by making the line. In this way, a more complex puzzle is put together than the perspective only on machines, on workers, or even the one-sided relation of the human to the machine. What counts is the machinic relation of humans, machines, and all the other components to the line and its motion. All these components draw the line and are drawn by it, taken into service for the continuous handling and improvement of the process, not for the sake of a static product, but rather for the incessant optimization of the line. And I draw your attention to the word draw here. It's of course also kind of artistic procedure, drawing the line. Now with logistics and containerization, concentrating on the product, on its efficiency and quality is replaced by a line running in spirals and feedback loops. So it's not only the assembly line anymore, but also this kind of new line of feedback loops, and its previous linearity and directedness must be rethought. Now, as an endless alinear line, a line going in all directions, a line that collects, accumulates, assembles, no longer an assembly line, but a line of assembly. Working on, in, and along the line has multiple implications. Working on the line means, first of all, a certain danger, a constant balancing act. There we're again at what Isabel calls precarization, I think. There is also an allusion to the digital network, of course, in the concept of the line, the online working. And when the fantasy of logistics regards humans increasingly as a factor to be eliminated, this does not mean that machinic capitalism functions without humans. For the human components, the line implies the expanded assembly line, the fabrica sociale. It's good that Sandro sits here next to me. As post-operative theory has formulated it, the social factory, which has simultaneously installed itself as the binding bond of a cooperation that has become servile. Within the enterprise, the line also relates to a vertical line, primarily in the term of line managers. I'm not going to go further into that, but Stefano Harney has really put up a very severe critique of this kind of police functions, only the line managers only being limited to these police functions. So he makes this difference between the line managers working as police officers and the leadership not anymore being really leading, but following and drawing the line, both aspects of drawing the line and being drawn by the line. And there comes up a certain term that I call vertical servility with this function of the line managers, but I'm going to go over this now. Now, working on the line also literally means working on the line itself, constantly improving and expanding it, appending something to it, all the way to the point of setting a new line. That is, as I said, also the new function of the leading management, the bosses who are not managers but leaders. Due to its complexity, they can no longer command, maybe even they can't, or clearly they can no longer understand the enterprise. Setting a line now means interpreting the line, narrating it like a story. Again, this is an artistic work. Following the line, understanding it in following and narrating it in understanding, they trace it, redraw it with every new turn, with each sudden break, with each unexpected leap. In this paradoxical logic, leading means following the line. The constant reforming and deforming of the line is the omnipresent foundation for working on it. If the line is continuously improved in every moment of the present, then its future is also to be determined. Metrics replaces measurement. The algorithm relies on a new relative derived derivative metrical measurement that measures efficiency only to speculate with it. The ongoing modulating and smoothing of the measurement, the incessant recalculation needs the complex logic of the algorithm. In this way, the line becomes a speculative line, not one that primarily has the value of a commodity, a business, a corporation in view, but rather the process and the speculation with the line itself. What the line becomes is the goal of all computations. And the line is also the individual line that traverses many single things. There again, this aspect of individuality comes into place. It connects not only the actors in the business on the vertical line, the line managers managing their or policing the others, the workers, not only the social factory as a new assembly line, but it also combines the parts of diverse single things that fit together to derive added value from this new arrangement. I want to hint you at a wonderful book that Randy Martin wrote. He died this January, but this book, Knowledge Ltd, came out after his death, and it's a great book, especially for the ones who are in a way involved in the knowledge industries, but I think it's a broader perspective, and Randy has this wonderful combination of being a performer, dancer, and a great Marxist economist, and that's a great book. I'm just quoting a bit out of it. The mass assembly line gathered all its inputs in one place to build a tightly integrated commodity that was more than the sum of its parts. Financial and engineering played this process in reverse, disassembling a commodity into its constituent and variable elements and dispersing these attributes to be bundled together with the elements of other commodities of interest to a globally oriented market for risk-managed exchange. Each of these movable parts is reassembled by risk attribute so that they become worth more as derivatives than their individual commodities. End of quote. Randy Martin, Knowledge Ltd is the book. And I think, I mean, he's not writing much about individuality, but I think in his quote it becomes clear that what individuality means on this level of derivatives. Logistics is no longer content with economic diagrams and flows, with calculations and predictions, with representations that precede the actions of the managers. It not only wants to purify the flow of goods from human time and human error, but to live in the concrete itself, in space at once, in time at once, in form at once. In this run on the concrete, mathematical calculations no longer simply calculate risks to control and minimize them, but instead play with ever greater risk. They are supposed to see in the future. See into the future, soothsayers, as Walter Benjamin said, produce futures, calculate probabilities based on currently achievable data. So I'm going to skip again half a page and get to the last page, so I'm finishing soon. I'm going to skip the explanation of what Randy Martin goes deeper into the differentiation of the terms white swan, black swan and blank swan, but I have to stick for a minute with the term blank swan, the third idea that comes from Eliace. To be clear that what I mean with the problematization of the idea of the colonization of the future. The traders of the blank swan are in pursuit along with them when they create, underwrite, draw derivative contracts virtually out of nothing. So we're in the world of financial economy in Wall Street, and what happens there is a certain creative act. Whereas black and white swans are based on probabilities. The blank swan is the animal of the unknowable, what is outside the realm of every probability calculation. The blank swan is the non-knowledge of the future, which has become the market. The human factor of machinic capitalism in this perspective consists in creating the event of drawing and of writing. The work of the traders consists in writing and drawing the derivative as a creatio ex nihilo. The image of the preconditionless tabula rasa permeates their fantasies. Without prior knowledge, foresight, or predictions, they transport themselves into the future. And the relationship to the future is still at the center. Even though it is supposed to be a future without predictions, the traders in hot pursuit of the future seem to forget about the present. Just like the white swan and the black swan, the blank swan remains in the logic of algorithmics and logistics, always in pursuit of what it is not. Creatio ex nihilo, traders not only as follow-ups of soothsayers, but also of genius artists. At the same time, this means not just the colonization of our future by today's soothsayers, but, and this is important, a brutal future of algorithms colonizing our past and our present. So it's reversed. Future rules the present time. This future, created by the artist trader, threatens now time. Our present is not anymore alarmed by the machinic attempt to predict the future. Through the combination of calculation and prediction, first the future is determined by counting all which is uncountable, assimilating all differences and dissembling dissimilarities, and then, or at the same time, our present is adapted to that determined future. So here I finally come back to no future. In a time where some cybernetical order seems to prevent us from entering the future, this is still this utopian idea of the future, I'd propose to remember the weak messianic force of God Save the Queen and Sex Pistols' angry, joyous, affirmative no future slogans from nearly 40 years ago. Turn it around, forget your desires for a better future, and individualize the present becoming. The here and now, the now time, fully in keeping with the described logic of algorithms, logistics, and derivatives, where only individuality counts. For these operations, we need the post-punk, funked-out power of anti-utopian individual monsters of now time, dissemblages subverting the visionary artist traders of machinic capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerald, and I'm inviting you to comment, to ask, to continue the discussion. We have this certain dynamics and continuity. Please, we have already. It's there behind. Does it work? Yeah.
Thank you. Yes? Yeah. Thank you very much for the panel. I'm really enjoying with all your expositions. And I have 3 questions for 3 different people in the table. And I would like to be precise and try to also to have a precise answer. With Malgo, can I call you Malgo? Gosha. I'm pretty much agree with you, what you say at the end of your presentation about that the strikes are 20th century form of mobilizations. I pretty much agree because I have been practicing already 21st one test on this, and I also include demonstrations on the 20th century kind of protests, and I think it doesn't change that much, and in the future we have to think in a different way. For example, we can talk about the struggle of internet, how internet is also getting something real in form of protest as well. And also how, for example, in Spain, you know, this PP government wanted to approve a new abortion law. And one of the strategies that women used in there was, okay, we cannot go to protest in the streets, we cannot like enter in the parliament. What we can do is be tricky and register our bodies as a private property so we can have a decision from them in the private. So there are different forms of protest, and I think this is something that is going up. And I would like to ask you if you know some other cases, or if you are thinking about how to support the struggles in a different way than demonstrations or strikes. To Sandro, it's a pleasure to listen to you. I have read some of your works and also an interview that you did recently about migration and refugees, the difference that there is between all of this, that I think is really quite enlightening for us. If in any moment you can extend a little bit about that. And I think you have been talking about it globally level, that there are ups and downs and all respond to capitalism. in certain ways. And I think it could be also mentioned that there is a crisis of representativity, no? Also, alongside to these ups and downs of capitalism. And I have the impression that every time the origin of this problem is being targeted better and better for these people that is claiming the crisis of representativity. I mean, since 2011 up to now, the people is targeting much better from where is coming the origin of the problem. If we are talking about capital, if we are talking about crisis of representations, the people have been going to the parliaments to protest, and they are different. And I think at the same time there are these up and downs of capitalism. In the other side, also, I think we have surrounding them in a certain way. I don't know if you have could extend a little bit more on that. And the other question is for Gerald. The last point, I'm really interested in this topic because I live in a city that has been declared a smart city, as Barcelona, as you know, and this is one of the main struggles of the new town hall to fight against this smart city, because what in a smart city means is that the big enterprises are collecting all your moves in your life in order to prepare new products and to sell you or your needs, no? Basically, this is the definition of a smart city, but then they say that this in order to prevent art from risk, from, you know, things that it would never happen in Barcelona. But, and I would like to mention also that the use of data has not been only used by the power, but also by the people. I mean, this is a battle between the smart cities against the smart citizens. And I put you an example of something that happens in Catalonia, that in the previous elections, not in these elections, but the before elections, we organized a social network campaign against the president of Catalonia, and we put fake identities accounts, and we start to chat between us, like if we were the son, the daughter of the president, the mechanic, you know, the people that he used to relate, and the people start to follow these conversations, and finally this crashed the communication campaign of this political party, and they lost 14 deputies in the elections by this. So what I wanted to say is that technology, yeah, is bad because they are collecting that data, but also we can use in a different way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question. I wouldn't say that we, in 21st century, we do not observe strikes. We do not observe them in particular locations in the world, because now in China, the strikes are constant, basically, because of the growing number of proletariat, of Chinese proletariat, coming from rural areas, being workers in electronic assembly lines. But the ways how, for instance, Foxconn workers strike are very different from the ways how, for instance, we are striking in Poland, because they have no leaders, exactly because they would be instantly arrested and jailed. And the way they are organized is in a very similar way as Indignado or other movements in Europe, which are anonymous and non-hierarchical, so flat. And this is very interesting. The other example I can think of, and the strikes in China will go on, hopefully. The other example I can think of is that in Poland, when they liquidated the state-owned enterprises, many workers went on hunger strike, which were very low efficient, which they didn't gain nothing basically in the early 90s. However, we now are facing few examples of taking over the means of production. I'm saying about the plant, for instance, in Greece, Viome, or other examples in France, where farmers takes the means of production also. The Another example I can think of, which is quite interesting in a way how we struggle, is based in is based in New York. So during Occupy Wall Street, there was a strike of public transport workers, namely the people who run the trolleys, the metro, the subways. But what they did is that they didn't say we will not work, but we will open the subway for all people, for them to go have a free ride. And this created unusual solidarity between users of subway, so people, and the workers. So, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for asking these two crucial questions. I will not expand very much upon the question of migration. That would be a good topic for another talk. I will just refer to what Isabel was saying yesterday at the beginning of her lecture, speaking of the autonomy of migration over the last months in and around Europe. I think that what happened over the last months shows a lot of what we can call, just with the word, necropolitics, that is kind of constitutive element of the European space itself, but it also showed the kind of powerful effects of migration, the kind of transformative power of migration. I think that speaking of kind of autonomy of migration is a good way to kind of introduce into the discussion a notion of autonomy that is not reducible to the kind of liberal interpretation of the autonomous subject that Isabel was reconstructing the other day. And I think it is important, you know, to add that when we talk of autonomy of migration, we don't talk of autonomy of migrants. You know, we don't look at the reasons why people are on the move in order to locate within these kind of motivations the element of autonomy. The element of autonomy comes out of the massification of certain behaviors, comes out of the social dynamics that traverse and make up migration. The question of representation, big question. I would say that we have been discussing about the crisis of representation for a couple of decades now, and there is still a need to be very attentive to the multiple dimensions of the crisis of representation. There is a need, you know, to look at places in the world where there has been over the last years kind of popular investment in representation. Just think of South America, but also think of India, I mean, if you go to India and you say, I mean, representation is in crisis, people will not easily understand you, because there is a huge investment in representative politics as a form of popular politics. And I am mentioning India more than Latin America, because, you know, in Latin America there were processes of kind of progressive politics, there were progressive governments. We know about these experiences. But in India, I mean, the kind of situation that you are confronted with if you look at representative politics is much more ambivalent, is much more confused, chaotic, messy. And so I am mentioning it in order to give an idea of the complicated nature of the question of the crisis of representation. Because then, also in India, if you look at the way in which representative institutions act, you will see very easily that, as everywhere in the world, the agency, the capability of action of these institutions is radically circumscribed and limited by the action of other kind of actors that do not follow the logics of representation. I will conclude by saying that there is also a need, in order to take stock, you know, of the experiences of the last years, to imagine a use of representative institutions beyond the logic of representation. I mean, to put it very shortly, this is the kind of lesson that I learned listening, for instance, to Pancho when he talks about Barcelona. I think there is an attempt in Barcelona, if Pancho says the truth, to use representative institutions beyond the logic of representation. And which is the logic of representation? Again, shortly put, I mean, just think of the relation between social movements, social struggles on the one hand, and representative institutions. In the tradition of the left, this relation has always been imagined and practiced as a kind of zero-sum game. There is struggle, there is social mobilization, it grows, it grows, it grows. Then there is the popular, the socialist government that represents the struggles and the mobilization which go down. In this sense, zero-sum game. I think it is absolutely necessary nowadays to imagine a use of representative institutions beyond this logic, to imagine the possibility of occupying representative institutions in order to relaunch and to make more powerful struggles, mobilizations, and movement. I hope it was clear, although a bit schematic.
So we stick to Barcelona in my answer, smart city. Of course, the developments of individual data flows and algorithmic changes and logistics are global, to be clear. So it's not the West or the former West that is the center of the more techno-political questions. No, but Barcelona is in Europe. And the smart city thing, yes, I appreciated that you talked about the resistance aspects towards it. Of course, I'm not arguing for what is the term Maschinensturm in English? what Luddites. I'm not thinking that we should storm or abolish the technical apparatuses, because I really have a Guattarian idea of a machine, and if we would destroy these machines, we would destroy our sociality. So no, and I appreciate your example, but I think I would like to put the answer of Sandro's in different terms. It's in a way about representation and going beyond representation, but without using the term representation. I'd like to propose again and again the term instituent practices for the practice that you were explaining, and I also like to not introduce but repeat the term institution of the common for what is going on in the municipality of Barcelona. I think that Ada Colau was very interesting also in the phase before the elections about her not contradictory but paradoxical use of saying that she's against representation and at the same time in a way in the function of representation. And this is wonderful, yeah. But I think the question is in between. Pancho mentioned the term monster institution or monsters, and I did it also in my last sentence. So when I'm thinking about anti-utopian individual monsters of now time, then I think we have to think about the relationship between instituent practices and institutions of the common. This is exactly the monster. And there I hope and I would do, and we all would do everything to support the projects in Barcelona and Madrid. But of course, there is always also this logic of us being the doctors and having a certain object of desire. And I think we should, of course, also ask ourselves what about the monsters in our own places, for instance, here in Warsaw.
Please, more questions and yes.
Thanks everybody for the fantastically interesting talks, I thought. I have a question for Gotcha, first of all. Okay, a clear difference, which was a very illuminating paper, I thought. A very clear difference between the strike and, for example, the demonstration or whatever, is that the strike is, as far as we know, the only way of hurting productive labor, right? That's why it does not work for social reproduction, as Silvia Federici has said many years back, right? And art also, you know, it doesn't really work. I know there have been instances of art strike, but it has not worked in those two occasions because they're not productive labor. And in some cases art is, but anyway. And I wanted to know if perhaps there are developments of other ways to hurt productive labor, which is not a strike. And so that's one question. And the other, can I have another one to Sandro?
Yes, please.
Right, okay. To Sandro, and I wanted to just ask you to clarify the concept of the multiplication of labor, if possible, because I'm not sure that I'm grasping it, you know, very well. And also, I think that the universal trend, which I mentioned before, the World Bank, is that there is a kind of labor which is not being paid universally anywhere, which is, of course, social reproduction labor. So there is this super trend, let's call it. Thank you.
Okay.
No, thank you, but this is a very hard question, I would say. What would you say? Are there any? Yeah. But you mean to hurt the productive system, the other forms of struggles? Yeah?
I haven't seen anything that can achieve what the strike can. Like, it is the only known way of protest that has to do with productive labor. Or you already mentioned this amazing thing of like letting the people go free. And I thought this is very interesting because that also hurts productive labor. But I don't know how often this can take place and on which scale. But if you know of any more, and how would you characterize this, this other means, if not strike, if they're not a strike?
Yeah, it's a question, how do we define a strike? Do we define it as only not performing work, or maybe a strike could be also defined as destroying the means of production? And we have historical examples of sabotage in many different places worldwide. In Poland, we have this kind of concept that we try to develop when the people can't go on strike, is that they take sick leave. And this is one thing that they can do, but do it collectively. And sometimes it works. Yeah, I know. If you think about a strike as not only not performing work, we can say of many different examples of solidarity strikes. As you say, especially in care sector or reproductive labor, there is a question of how can we struggle exactly because we are taking care of other people. And if you leave them, they will be deprived of care. So in Poland, one of the most militant union, which is the Nurses and Midwives Union, uses the concept of solidarity strike. They tried to engage bus drivers in public transportation, and once it actually was very successful in one hospital when they went on strike. The bus drivers started the strike, not the nurses. They had a three way of connecting these struggles. One way, very simple, is that the bus drivers were the husbands of nurses. That's why they could build the connection. But they also were members of a larger organization, a kind of federation of unions, and they could make this kind of links of solidarity. And the nurses didn't have to, leave the patients. And the struggle was quite loud because people knew about the situation in the hospital. So, but also nurses in Poland do a lot of different occupations, and this is the basic tools of this kind of workers, because they cannot go on strike the same as kindergarten workers, elderly carers, etc. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Well, multiplication of labor is an attempt to make sense of the division of labor in a situation in which this division has become less stable than it used to be. In a situation in which the boundaries between different forms of labor are continuously tested, and in which the reinstatement of the element of division becomes more and more violent because it is arbitrary. So, multiplication of labor is, in our intention at least, an attempt to produce a different kind of gaze on what has been traditionally analyzed in terms of division of labor. I was trying to emphasize the fact that the labor, the living labor I was talking about is traversed and divided by a multiplicity of boundaries. And implicit in my talk was also the idea that each of these boundaries is an important site of struggle, is an important site of contestation. So multiplication of labor also means multiplication of the sites of struggle and contestation. At the same time, I close here, to talk of a multiplication of labor also implies the fact that more and more differences, so to say, are put into play in the way in which labor is experienced by exploited subjects in many parts of the world. I can say more, but I don't want to colonize.
Please.
Very short, just to give it into the discussion and to answer one of your questions, Angela. The Precarias alla Deriva I spoke yesterday, they write about something like a care strike, and not in the traditional sense of striking. They try to invent a new definition of striking. This is the same direction of the argument Malgorzata just did. And in this concern that the privatization and the invisibility of care work has to be broken open, has to be brought to the public, whatever you define the public as. And it is not about stopping caring or care working. It's a different thinking of what a strike can be. So this.
Thank you very much to all of the speakers. I actually wanted to ask all of you, including you, Boris, to say something about this future versus now time, because I think it's kind of, I mean, it would be nice to have other people discuss this. So if you want, but to the punky part of the panel, I have this question, because somehow I was thinking of this no future claim as a now time. On one hand, as a very interesting for me and my thinking of the ordinary, the common, etc., as a resistance to this acceleration pattern, partially, because not entirely as I understand, but partially it's a very interesting resistance. But then when I think about the ordinary and my insistence on that, there seems to be some sort of disconnection, let's say, because the way I see the ordinary now is that it's precisely this kind of position that is condemned to the no future, but is obliged also to think about its future in terms of, like, I don't know, persistence or whatever. So I'm curious how you would address this, let's say, controversy about this standpoint. As much as I appreciate the Benjaminian thinking, obviously, but I think, I mean, I have a trouble with this.
Sami, will you try?
Yeah, sure. But let's not make it too complicated. I mean, but actually it's complicated because there is a difference between having, I mean, no future, at least my claim was no future is different from dead temporality. So no future is actually, you can also see a positive attribute of having no future, like having a lack. So a lack, which is an articulation of a problem, and it's not a flat temporality. It's still, the claim was this is still historical time. In a way, there is a tension, there is a kind of unfulfillment, there is a yearning, there is something articulated in the punk gesture of no future. Today we're talking about other things. We don't even have no future, I would say. So the problem is that I mean, it was in Gerald's paper present that we are basically indebted to the future. The future time has colonized our time. And phenomenologically, it feels like the spurious infinity of n+1. It's always repetitive, the same, even though everything has to be changed, violently changed, in order to keep this alive. And Benjamin, the reference to Benjamin is of purely heuristic nature.
So Jetztzeit, now time, messianic time are only kind of models to understand what a proper historical concept of historical time would be, as distinct from the time that we have today. I would say we don't have history. We have temporalities that can be mapped in space. But this is the difference. That is why I say we are not punks anymore. We don't even have no future.
Yeah, just to add something, I mean, it's not much different from your point, Sami. Just wanted to repeat that it is, from my point of view, the kind of main logic that people are thinking about is the defensive logic of defending our future, which is being colonized. And I really want to attack this ideology. It's not about the future, our future that is colonized, or it's, at least that's not the main point, but the other way around. The future, or these forms of prediction and of modes of subjectivation that go under prediction, there the future colonizes the present time. So, and of course, we can't use the punk version anymore. That's why in the last sentence I said post-punk. We have to develop new post-punk monsters in this sense that fight for, and here it's again Benjamin, for the relationship and the ruptures between present and past. Forget the future. This was the point.
I like to think from very materialistic ground about the future, in the sense that from the ecological perspective, I would say, there is now a very loud book published by Naomi Klein, Capitalism versus Climate Change. And this like forces us to reflect that either we will end up with constant wars, which will end up when the resources will finally finish. But this also forces us to think that we are constantly making future generation in debt. And in this sense, we also have to think about that the constant crisis of capitalism will finally stop, and because of the lack of the resources, and the perpetuation or the cyclic waves of crisis will end up either with a very catastrophical picture, or if we point to some ecological movements, to other solutions. However, the capitalism will not give up, and will not, as in the sense of stop, because it's the changes and the using of resources is inherently inscribed into its modes of production, and that's I don't want to be so pessimistic, but this is the way I like to think about it.
You asked also me to shortly comment. I would say just to remind you that this no future event was in fact, I mentioned already, Sex Pistols rented a boat on a river of Thames and performed God Save the Queen to sabotage the official event of it was Silver Jubilee of the Queen. So they were criticizing the critique official history, official narrative, historical narrative, and the performance of the official history. No future was this act of sabotage, of a claim to another temporality, claim to against official culture of commemoration. And instead of commenting, I would also, I think this is extremely interesting and motivating to say that it's rather the other way around. It is this form of future that is colonizing our present. But how does it relate to this proliferation or I would say investment, huge investment of utopian energy in the past, in all this proliferation of these memory cultures, of industry of commemoration, when I say investment of utopian energy into memory, into cultural memory. You know, these expectations, if we properly remember Auschwitz, something similar will never happen again, etc., etc. How this cultural, including contemporary art, obsession with the past relates to this form of a future. What sort of temporality is it? I leave it like, as a rhetorical question for us to think and you to react. But please, there is a question.
So just two questions, one theoretical and the other very practical. First concerns the notion of individuality, and it's both probably to Sandro and to Gerald. And how would you relate this kind of idea of work being individual to the concept and practice of thinking of labor force as human capital? Because what does this notion mean, human capital? The fundamental distinction that we have in the Marxian political economy, yeah, between the worker selling his labor power and getting income, and capitalist making profit, is merged in this notion. Yeah, you as a worker, you are obliged to invest in yourself, for example, through education or perpetual training, and your income is pictured as something coming out of this investment, and the distinction between capital and labor is blurred through this apparatus. So I'm wondering, how would you relate the idea of like fragmentation of labor or individuality to this kind of merge which we witness with the notion of human capital? And the practical question, Malgorzata mentioned strikes of care sector. I'm wondering what interesting kind of examples of strikes in education, including higher education, you know, because firstly, we've mentioned here that in the report there was an information about it that artists somehow feel themselves connected to higher education workers, and I would just like to mention that on 14th of this month there's a strike, demonstration of teachers, and on 20th there's going to be an event connected with protests in higher education. So maybe some practical hints how to protest in these two sectors. Thank you very much.
Gerald?
It's really a huge question. I just finished a book on dividuum. It will be out in spring in the English version. So for me it's hard to answer. You know, you have to learn what you have written when you have finished the book. But one thing maybe to be clear, I never spoke, but it's an interesting question. I don't want to refuse it, but I just want to say that I never spoke of work being individual. So individuality is maybe on a different level. including something which is connected to the multiplication of labor and whatever thing, also to the aspects of precariousness that Isabel was hinting at. There is something that I would call a subsistential individuality. Don't want to get too much in this term, but where on a social ontological level we have to acknowledge that we're all divided before somebody puts a pressure on us and divides us. This is a very important point because it's also attracted against the logic, the old logic, and the really resistive logic, in a negative sense, resistive logic of the possessive individualism. And there, on this level, I think it helps us also to think resistance, not on a personal or individual or kind of the mass being a mass of individuals. That might help, but on the level of work being individual, I'm a bit skeptical, but I have to think about it. Thanks for the question.
I wouldn't like to put myself into position that I know how to strike in higher education, although I would like to know how to do it. Currently, I have a part-time contract at Warsaw University, but there are two examples, quite recent. One, how to maybe not strike, but organize. One is in Poznań, or was in Poznań, when academics mobilized to defend cleaners at the university, which also creates this kind of solidarity bond, and also makes us think that without those people, our work is impossible. It's impossible to perform without having a clean space, or having a cloak room, or having a social safe space. And it's also happening now in Wrocław. What we try to do is try to defend and collect the signatures against flexibilization of working condition of cloakroom workers at Wrocław University. But I think this kind of those are the first steps. I don't know where they will follow, but we can say that they are weak. But this is the only tools that we have right now. So in the sense, we as art workers or as academics, we always have to think ourselves as a part of a broader picture, or part of the production chain, in particular workplaces or systems, in the sense that without defending cloakroom workers or defending or struggling with the cleaners, we will also not succeed. And if we think that the working conditions of cleaners or cloakroom workers are now under the threat, we have to imagine, and this forces us to imagine that in a month, or two, or in a half of a year, our working condition will also be threatened, which is also happening right now in Poland.
Yes, I will try to be very quick. Couple of words on this crucial question of strikes. I think strikes continue to be really important. We have had, for instance, in the logistics, kind of global cycle of strikes over the last 4 or 5 years that has been reconstructed by several militant researchers who have looked at ports from the US to Australia, to warehouses, again from the US to Mexico to northern Italy, and so on. These strikes have been particularly important, and some of them particularly effective. I would also say that in front of the composition of contemporary living labor that we have been discussing over these 2 days, there is a kind of problem talking about strikes. And this problem lies in the fact that many, let's say, workers are not in a position to go on strike. Simply because of their kind of contractual situation, because they are project workers and so on. I mean, it would be quite easy in every city, in a city like Warsaw, for instance, to draw a map of the people whose activity contributes to the production of value, whose activity is in a way exploited, but who are not in a position, to go on strike. So I think that nowadays we have to invent also new forms of strike, while old forms of strike continue to be very important. The question of human capital, I think it is a very important question, and again, to put it very shortly, this is a concept that has allowed, let's say, neoliberalism to read the transformations of labor in a way that was much more effective than the way proposed by many people on the left. Human capital is a kind of lens that allows to read, I continue to use this metaphor, what I was calling before the multiplication of labor, and to translate it into the language of capital's valorization. Human capital is a lens that allows to identify potentialities for the production of value where traditional kind of economics doesn't see this potentiality. It would be very easy to demonstrate this talking about the transformations of the politics of poverty in many parts of the world. Talking about, for instance, the relation between human capital and another important word that is resilience. And it is precisely the combination between human capital and resilience that allows to make poverty productive in many parts of the world, which means to make the daily labor, pain, suffering of the poor productive also from the point of view of capital's accumulation and valorization. So I take very seriously this notion of human capital. And another interesting and important example would be precisely migratory policies. Because, we are always kind of struck by the tendency to make the crossing of borders more and more difficult. We tend to emphasize what I was calling before the necropolitical effects of migratory and border regimes. But there are also other migratory policies that aim at recruiting migrants in a very selective way. These migratory policies employ the language of human capital as one of their constituent elements.
If there are no more questions or comments,
there
is one.
Yeah, one.
Gigi,
if there's time.
You are the last one.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you all very much for the presentations. I'm afraid that you might get touched whatever I will ask here. Two things that I kind of stayed very much with me was how Sami kind of ended his talk, which he said about these unrelated now points on how he was actually elaborating on temporality, and the whole kind of elaboration of Gerald's around the line, and particularly when he said that the workers appear in the line while making the line. So somehow, I wonder if you could, if you see some links between those two, and actually if we can actually elaborate a bit on the idea of line and linearity or unrelated kind of linearity. And a much more kind of specific question to Sandro, which again I might just, I mean I might ask you to elaborate a bit more on crisis and expansion, but now it's too late. So I'll just ask a very kind of maybe naive question, which is, I find very interesting this whole concept of the global multiplication of labor. And I can see how you link it with the whole idea of crisis and expansion. But can you see it working the other way? So the kind of, to actually maybe perhaps this global multiplication of labor within crisis produce conditions of homogenization of labor, of actually seeing people within the same condition of potentially, of course, you know, I'm just hypothetically here. So yeah, that's it.
Please, short, precise answers. Sami?
Thanks for this question. Unrelated now points are, you can say, is a way to spatialize time. So you can say that now points are countable, are numbered, is the condition of possibility of having continuity of the working day. So Marx's old argument, how you can count time until 24 hours, and that is the continuity of what is today called 24/7 capitalism. They are unrelated insofar as they are spatializable or spatialized, and to this extent disposable. That's why I would say they're unrelated. The unrelatedness is another way to address the issue of a certain flatness or the subtraction of attention, which otherwise would be a historical concept of history in its own unfulfillment, without yearning for some, you know, golden future or want to return to some golden past, which would be, you know, the melancholic stance towards loss, the impossible object of desire. No, it's rather accepting it as lack. That was my point with accepting the positive notion of having no future. But unrelated now points is such a everyday thing that we take it still today for granted, that the only way to express time is space and vice versa. Since Aristotle's physics, this is the normal way to think. But there are other things to think about time, other ways to think about time, but the most economic way to map the two on each other is probably capital, or more or less the category of abstract labor that can do it.
Abstract labor and abstract lines are very different. So this is also the kind of the line between Marx and Guattari, maybe. The abstract individual line has nothing to do with abstract labor. The line, of course, in this sense, is non-linear. It's not linearity, because you used the term linearity. It's going in all directions, and it's been ruptured all of the time. And the one aspect of my talk was to have the figures of the trader and the leader of a corporation, for instance, as kind of repeating the figure of the genius artists, drawing the line from nothing on the one hand. On the other hand, of course, following Stefano Harney, the leader doesn't know how to lead, but he's in a way led, drawn by the line, which he only narrates or translates. So it's a twofold way, but especially with the figure of the trader, again, I'm repeating the figure of the reversal of this future-present time relation. The figure of the trader wants to produce the future. He or she wants to make what is not measurable, or what is uncountable, countable. Again, the future colonizes our present.
2 words, because otherwise Boris gets angry. Yes, there are of course moments in time, situations in space where the crisis has a kind of homogenizing effect. We had many instances in the last years. But what I am trying, to think is kind of temporality that is predicated on the contemporary presence of crisis and development, to put it in a very simple way. And so there is no linearity in the dynamics of crisis in which we can trust to build a kind of politics of labor. There are moments in which this homogenizing effect is present, and you have to catch this moment, you have to deal with it, but I don't think there is a tendency, to put it very quickly, toward an homogenization of labor, precisely because of this kind of scattered temporality which combines elements of crisis and elements of development.
Thank you all, the participants of the panel and the audience.